how and why Yugoslavia had been divided. But before we can talk about how it fell apart, we need to talk about how the country was created. Yugoslavia started out as an idea. For centuries, this region of the world had been ruled by foreign powers, mostly the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But most of the people who lived here were neither Austrian, Hungarian, or Ottoman. They were Slavic, and Slavs saw themselves as a distinct ethnicity with its own culture, history, and traditions. And so Yugoslavia was the idea of a unified state, inhabited by Slavic people and ruled by Slavic people. And this idea came around the same time countries like Germany and Italy unified into distinct countries, with their unification also, in part, based around the idea that Italians and Germans each had their own unique ethnic identity. But there was a problem with this Yugoslav idea. While Serbia and Montenegro had gained independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1878, most of what would become Yugoslavia was still under Austro-Hungarian rule, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire wasn't going to give up a large part of its territory just so the Slavs could have their own nation right across its border. But then World War I happened. And in World War I, Serbia and Montenegro were occupied by the Austro-Hungarian Empire and their governments fled to allied countries. And there, in 1917, leaders of Montenegro, Serbia, and representatives from the Austro-Hungarian regions of Slovenia, Croatia, Vojvodina, and Bosnia-Herzegovina declared that they would join together to form a new nation, a nation they called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. This nation was supported by the Allies, who liked the idea of breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire into smaller countries. And by the end of World War I, Austria-Hungary started falling apart. There were revolutions in Vienna and Budapest, the capitals of the Austrian and Hungarian parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Czechia and Slovakia declared their own independence shortly after, and in the midst of this breakup, the southern territories of the empire declared its own independence. Serbia and Montenegro were liberated, and the three regions joined together to officially form the Kingdom of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. Over time, a few more territories were added to the kingdom, such as 4 small Bulgarian territories and the monastery of St. Nuam. In 1929, they decided that the British way of naming their country wasn't very catchy, and they became the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, with Jug meaning south and Slavini meaning Slavs. And so the country was called the Land of the South Slavs. And they were right to call it Yugoslavia, because South Slavs is too much of a tongue twister. But this kingdom didn't last very long, because in 1941, Hungary, Germany, and Italy came to visit for a world war. And while Yugoslavia's army surrendered, its people did not. Instead, Yugoslavia organized the largest resistance of all the occupied nations in Europe. By 1945, the people of Yugoslavia managed to completely kick out the Axis forces from their soil, with only minor support from the Allied countries at the very end of the war. Because Yugoslavia was a strong independent country who needed no foreign liberation. The faction which liberated the country was communist. So after taking control over the government, they turned Yugoslavia into a socialist nation and called itself the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. They also gave their old flag a 1-star review and made that their new flag. The new nation was founded on 3 basic concepts. Firstly, it recognized various ethnicities within the country as equals through the idea that they all helped to liberate the country from foreign occupation. The second was that the nation's economy would be managed through socialism. And thirdly, that the country was governed as a federation of 6 equal republics with a large degree of autonomy. These republics were Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, and Croatia. Additionally, the regions of Vojvodina and Kosovo were granted autonomy while still being part of the Republic of Serbia. While there were other foundations upon which Yugoslavia was formed, it is these 3 which were the most important. And it is also these 3 foundations which would cause the eventual breakup of Yugoslavia, because the fall of nations rarely has a single cause. Rather, it's a combination of various issues which, together, cause the collapse of nations, and Yugoslavia is no different in this regard. So first, let's talk about the Yugoslav political system. Being a communist country, Yugoslavia was a close friend of the Soviet Union, and the Yugoslav governments controlled many aspects of the nation. But in 1948, the country politically distanced itself from the Soviet Union after the leaders of the 2 countries disagreed on what the future relationship between the 2 nations should be. In the 60s and 70s, the country began reforming its political system by handing over more and more control away from the central government and towards the individual republics. These changes included, among other things, giving the republics and autonomous regions more control over their own economies, giving them more influence in the central government, and giving the individual republics local armed forces which were separate from the national army. But there was one thing which barely changed during this time: the presidency. After World War II, a man named Josip Broz Tito became president of Yugoslavia and retained the position until his death. He personally controlled a large part of the national government and was an important force in keeping the nation stable. But there is a problem with relying on a single person to run essential aspects of your government rather than relying on an institution. If a king dies, a president loses an election, or a prime minister falls ill, then the position will be filled by somebody else while the institution of monarch, president, or prime minister remains. In Yugoslavia, the country relied on a single person, Josip Tito, until he died in 1980 and there was nobody to replace him as president. Instead, the presidency was transformed into a collective presidency. This meant that the 6 republics and 2 autonomous regions would each get 1/8 of the presidency and would need to make decisions via a majority.